We say thank you to those that made their way back from lunch. On the Fridays, we always lose a lot of people after lunch, and so you all get a gold star. If we had gold stars next year, we'll actually have little gold stars. That's a good idea. Okay, so this final panel, well, actually, before I launch in, let me say that a lot of people have been asking me about the PowerPoints, wanting the PowerPoints. We're collecting them now. We're going to post them somewhere on our center's website, I'm sure. And I think we have, if you registered, I think we have your email, so we can probably send an email out telling you what the link is when it's done. Everything in this, I guess I should have told everyone this much earlier. I think everything in this room is recorded.
And will be attributed.
You guys are fine. Yeah. Who knows what goes on in the back row up here? So the presentations themselves, I think we can post. It takes us a while to get those files. And I guess I should say, if you were a presenter and you don't want to be that posted, let me know. We'll just black out your face and disguise your voice or something. But we'll let you know when that's available.
What about the presentations of the?
No idea. Well,
Monday.
From the Indigenous Water Seminar, we've collected the PowerPoints and are posting those. I don't think there's anything in addition to those PowerPoints that were. The program is posted in the PowerPoints. I'm not sure what the plan is with Dustin and Lucia about their one, but that's what I know. Okay. So let's move on. Final, that sounds so serious. Our final panel. And this is a tradition we have here of always having a panel at the end, and no pressure, but we always get deep thinkers for our final panel who are supposed to have insightful, broad, brilliant thoughts. Again, no pressure. In this conference, it's funny that we've had a pretty broad, ambitious discussion already. So to make it bigger and try to tie a bow on it at the end, I think is probably impossible. But we'll have an interesting conversation. I guess I'm just not sure what it's going to look like. And there will be no PowerPoints, as you may. So we rose the screen. I don't know if you didn't notice, may not have noticed before. This is an actual functioning courthouse. There are trials from time to time that happen here. In which case, you'd all be sitting at the other side of the table, and this would be spun around, and you'd all be arguing with each other, and the audience would be silent. And that's the opposite of what we're looking for in this panel. We want a lot of audience participation, and that's the main reason we do this, is because while we always plan on providing for a lot of audience participation, the schedules always get away from you a little bit, and that always gets cut a little bit. And so especially for those of you that have made the commitment to stay to the end, we want to make sure that you have all the chances you might want to ask questions, and also to, I don't want to say make speeches, because people have made speeches, and I don't want to cut anyone off. But if there's a point someone in the audience wants to make, you'll have your chance in this panel. Okay. Yeah. But not now, right? No PowerPoints. Oh, I wasn't kidding earlier when I said we should not allow you to attend anymore. It's always those people in the back, I tell you. Oh, okay. Two members of the panel you've already heard from. Teodoro was also going to be on our panel, but he had to travel. So two members you've already heard from, Tony McLeod and Rebecca Tharm. So I won't even attempt to tell you who they are, because if you don't know by now, you just haven't been paying attention anyway. Let me tell you about the new people on the panel here. John Fleck. John, raise your hand, John. That's John. John is with the University of New Mexico's water program, where he's been is it the scholar in residence or
Writer in residence.
That's a lower bar, I think, than scholar.
It's quite a low bar.
Okay.
We made it up while we were walking to lunch one day.
So that was your choice, was it? Yeah. Okay. But before that, he was a journalist. I was going to say functioning journalist, but that sounds really insulting to other journalists. And kind of gave up that world to follow his heart, and he's written a book recently about the Colorado River. It's not out yet, but I assume I've read it. I mean, I've read your blog, and we've talked 1,000 times. So I assume I know everything in the book just already, and it's great. Unless you screwed it up at the last minute, it's great. This is why is director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. I think you were a water manager at Tucson Water when I first met you. No, maybe not.
It's on active management area.
Tucson Active Management Area, that's right, when I first met her. And before her recent coming back to the university, she was working at the White House, which sounds very prestigious, on the National Climate Assessment. So I think it's fair for us to expect brilliant comments out of Kathy. And Kelsey Leonard at the end. Kelsey's the only member of this panel I don't really know. So I read her bio, and because someone said, oh, she's a student. So I said, oh, but said, oh, she's a really smart student. So I read her bio, and yes, she's a student, but she's also has her bachelor's, master's, and JD degree, and is getting her PhD, and has this long history of working, doing good work with great organizations. And so, you know, what I've been told is that you're also going to offer brilliant comments.
I will try.
So I don't mean to pick on anyone, but I just always inherently end up doing that. How does that work? Okay. So out of fairness to this group, I said I'd ask a few questions to get things started, and I'd send those questions in advance. And so I sent out some questions, I think it was a week ago today. And a lot's happened in the last week. And so those questions are not as finely focused now as I thought they were a week ago. So I'll drift away from them a little bit, but not too much, because I know you've invested some time thinking about them. So that's the plan. And I'm going to ask these questions, and we'll talk, and we'll see how it goes. And after doing that for a while, I'll let you guys ask questions, and we'll talk and see how it goes. And then we'll adjust from there. So the first question I had on my list really spoke to the central theme of the conference, and that is, you know, it's actually possible to learn from each other. It's actually possible to look around the world and gain lessons that might be relevant to wherever you live and you practice. And we heard references to Alfred Deakin and bringing lessons back to Australia in the 1880s, was it, Tony? Look at that. All right. And Mike Mueller talked to us a little bit about South Africa's efforts in the probably early 1990s to do kind of a similar thing, and looking at lessons from around the world that could influence the new water program in South Africa. And I think in both cases, and it's been pointed out by several people, it's a lot easier to find lessons of that is not what you should do, rather than that is what you should do. But in any case, the idea that there are lessons to be captured and brought home and tweaked to fit local circumstances is kind of the underpinning idea of the conference. And we spoke more today about that, about what those themes are, than I thought we would. That's why this question is not quite as perhaps as relevant as it was before. And some of you, namely Tony, got plenty of time to answer questions of this nature about what are the lessons, what parts of a model can be moved around. So I guess I will suggest, Tony, that don't feel any obligation to say what you've already said. Mm-hmm. And this goes for the whole panel of Everybody doesn't need to feel obligated to respond to every question, including questions from me. But let me just put this out here because I know you all jotted down some notes. So let's talk about a little bit. Lessons. What are the lessons that we've really learned, and specifically, what are the transferable lessons? Because I think that is really what we're interested in here. And the format is whoever wants to start can start. If there's no volunteers, I'm going to point at John just because I like to do that. John.
So do you want to sort of phrase the question, or you want me to?
No, well.
Okay. So,
John, I'm trying to leave the question is broad, and so you can go wherever you want with it.
So Doug's question had to do with the lessons from the basins we're most familiar with. I'm familiar with both the Rio Grande, where I live, and the Colorado River Basin, and I think that I saw a lot of evidence that the lesson I'm going to be describing from my own basin, I think sort of applies with some generality across a lot of the other basins I heard discussed over the last 4 days. And that is that independent of the specifics of the structure of governance, the sort of nature of federal and state, provincial, regional, indigenous community roles, that we have water that we're trying to govern across a whole bunch of different sorts of boundaries, and that the success of those governance efforts requires a sort of functioning human network. You know, Michelle Lee this morning talked about network governance and the sort of structures of the individuals of who talks to who, and that having a robust sort of network of human beings who know one another, who know how to work together across their institutional boundaries at both formal and informal levels is critical to the success. And what Amy was talking about yesterday involving what's going on now in Arizona is a great example of what we need to be able to activate to deal with difficult issues of scarcity. And if they succeed, that'll be awesome. And I know it's a heavy lift and a tough challenge. But what we see going on in the lower Colorado is sort of taxing to the fullest extent the ability of that network to sort of function successfully. And that exists independent of the sort of specific legal and institutional and governance structures. It involves the sort of shared understanding of the system that Kevin especially, and really interested in what Laura Key's done both in the lower Colorado with Mexico and then in the Nile, that sort of shared understanding. So the sort of networks of social capital and formal and informal relationships are across all these boundaries are sort of the critical element to the success in the Colorado River Basin and some of the failures that we've heard discussed in the Rio Grande right now, especially the litigation between Texas and New Mexico.
Follow up on that?
Okay,
Yeah.
I will. Sure. So I'm coming from the perspective of somebody who has primarily managed groundwater as opposed to surface water. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing happen is sort of the integration of the conversation about groundwater management and surface water management in the context of managing these rivers, because obviously that's actually part of the solution, I believe, because you can do a lot more when you use aquifers in conjunction with surface water flows and reservoirs to manage a river. But I think sort of more generally, and this is also based on my experience, it's really important not just to have institutions, but to have institutions that are functioning and well-resourced and respected. And the reason that's true is that when they're not, and you're not investing in monitoring, and there's no evaluation of success, it's very hard to have adaptive management if you're not actually paying attention to what's going on. And so, for example, Arizona has a really innovative groundwater management system, and they brag about it all the time, and they use it to whale California with, but they've completely defunded the management system, and so it's not going to survive without additional investment. I guess two other things I'd like to mention that are consistent with what I just said is recognizing the potential for policy interventions and the timing of it is a rare talent. Not everybody can sort of rise above the current constraints and see what looks like as a constraint as an opportunity, and sort of be ready for that moment. And so I think that capacity is really important. And then finally, I do think that cross-scale tension is actually a good thing. So having worked for a part of the Arizona Department of Water Resources that represented a local scale basin, but having sort of the bad guys in Phoenix be the ones that carried the stick, I could sort of play them off, and I could be the good cop, they could be the bad cop. There can actually be some really positive things that happen in the tension between the local scale and the state scale, or the state scale and the federal scale. So those are just opportunities that I think need to be identified.
Okay. So I think from the presentations that we heard this week, one of the notes to take away is that as Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, we are that. We are nations, we're not stakeholders. So, as academics and practitioners in the room, I think you have to start to think about what is your role in making sure that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations have an equitable role in the decision-making process if we're actually concerned about justice. And with that, this seat at the table is not something that should be tokenism. You can't just have potentially an academic scholar that is either Indigenous or works with Indigenous peoples speaking for Indigenous peoples. You need to actually have elected leaders that are within a position of power and decision-making within these water resource management boards, bodies, planning arenas. Additionally, you should start to ask yourselves, whether you're from an academic background or a government background, do you have a First Nation consultation policy? Within the United States, the president has issued an order that all federal agencies are supposed to have consultation policies with First Nations. I could probably count on my hand how many of those federal agencies actually have an approved consultation policy. And that order was issued in 2009. So within Canada, it's even less. When we look at Australia, it's even less. And at your university levels, you should, and there are some universities that do, that you could use as a template, have consultation policies for your interactions with First Nations and with Indigenous peoples. Most likely, you have a diplomatic policy for when a dignitary of state comes to your university. That policy should also be incorporating First Nations. And with that, you can then embody more of the principles of UNDRIP, looking at free, prior, and informed consent, not just from a governmental policy level, but also at your university levels in terms of being academics and practitioners. I'll pause there.
Thanks, because that links a little bit to my sense of the last few days of hearing the discussion is that environmental water and environmental flows is actually a very essential element of the discourse, and it is a part of that discourse and discussion in all these basins that are facing water scarcity. And that was a very encouraging signal, I think, in being at this conference. I think management in river basins has shown that when social and environmental flows social aspects of environmental flows are included in that decision making, that there's actually it's a very effective vehicle for getting water back into rivers in a more sustainable way, and also allowing more constructive debate and cooperation to happen. In order to do that, to include those social needs into the environmental flow conversation, we really need to understand some of these challenges around the structures, the frameworks that are in place that allow that connection, whether it's at the peer-to-peer science level in terms of the actually calculating the flow needs, or at the level of implementation in some of the basins in which we work across the world. In many cases, in the field, we may be working directly in collaboration and consultation with Indigenous people, but we're very seldom, from the science, in the science world, in the position to understand the context or to be able to influence that context in that process of engagement. And I think that's a challenge, how to be better informed going into those river basin projects and processes where we are trying to bring environmental flow requirements into the discussion, to be better informed up front about that, and to be aware in the discussion of where are the appropriate places to engage with local communities, and particularly with Indigenous communities, on their associations with the flow regimes of the rivers and their values and needs for how those systems are managed. So it's a challenge both in terms of bringing that information in at the right time and place, and in many of the places in river basins in which we work, there isn't even a voice in the room around either environment or social aspects. So we've heard a lot about there being at least some evidence of a voice on the environment side or the social side in this forum, but in many basins that really isn't the case at all. So that's I think a challenge before us all in terms of what we've learned from basins. It's possible to have environmental flows as part of that discourse. It's very valuable to do so. It's lacking that social sciences integration, and many places we're not well positioned when we go into that discussion to really make the most effective use of our knowledge and our experience.
I'd like to start with perhaps the point that people talk about, are there transferable lessons between river basins? And I'm always reminded by the sort of comment you can make about people is you are unique, just like everybody else. And I think there is transferable lessons between them. That's probably the first thing I'd say. The second thing is about, I think one of the things I've seen from thinking about this week's presentations and discussions is how you define the problem is a big determinant on the sort of solutions you actually see emerge from the conversations that have around that. And part of the way, in the Australian experience of involvement in Indigenous people going back in previous times has been, a failure to even imagine that they actually have a voice at the table. And I think actually addressing that and actually just how we describe the problem that they're setting out to actually address can make a big difference to the nature of the problem that emerges from all the work that goes into solving it. And that is another way, perhaps, of going back to other points already about the involvement, the social framework in which you actually seek to solve the problem is, I think, really important. And I'll probably leave it there for that comment.
Let me run through a couple more of these little questions and I'll open it up. I said something really stupid the other day. You're supposed to go gasp. The audience gasp, it says on my sheet here. Someone said, why is there so much, why does your event focus so much on Australia? Why is and you heard that we initially thought about just doing Australia and southwestern U.S. as a point of comparison. And I said because the Murray-Darling Basin is the gold standard for how to deal with water scarcity. That's what I said. And it's much too simplistic, and there are different opinions certainly about how accurate that statement would be. There's certainly a lot of things about the Murray-Darling Basin that excite me, about the CAP, the basin plan, the embracing of markets. But I've heard a lot of things this week that give me some reasons for concern. And to get back to Tony's last point, and Tony could take the fifth on this. That's a U.S. expression. You don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. But let me make this question a little easier, a little different than the way I phrased it to you in last week, which was, is it the gold standard? If not, why not? Or if so, yes. I think after a week of talking about this, we're all a little more sophisticated in our thinking about, what works in one place has to be tailored to work in another place, and you can't just superimpose these things. But if you want to take a swing at this question about, is it the closest thing we have to getting it right? Talk about that. But perhaps more importantly, Pat didn't already get to it. What are the essential elements? What would a model perfect arrangement look like? Maybe that's not a fair question given that what we just talked about. But I'm rambling here, so someone say something insightful. Rebecca, save me.
I don't know if I'll save you, but I'll say I can answer something in between the gold standard and the ideal situation in relation to the Murray-Darling case that strikes me, and that is that the Murray-Darling Basin case for me shows that they've ventured into environmental flow implementation. They've ventured into an area that's very challenging and difficult, and they've been brave enough and transparent enough and open up about how they've done that. And I think that's really allowed the evolution of some very interesting approaches and tools that are essential elements of what needs to be in place in an ideal situation in effective river basin management. And many other basins haven't braved even determining those flow needs, never mind actually getting them implemented and adaptively refining them. So I think this adaptive monitoring, this refinement of the strategy around environmental watering, for example, looking at prioritization process on where to put those flows back into a big system, the hard conversation about which are the critical places, which are the places if we only have a certain amount of water to reinvest on the resource base and our environmental sustainability, which should those places be? And then, delivering that water and monitoring it and being, and reporting back on it, auditing it, benchmarking that performance. Those are, I think, essential elements of an ideal process in the area in which I work, certainly, that the Murray-Darling has showcased and been courageous enough, I think, to put out there as an example from which others can learn and which other people can draw and tailor and adapt to their local basin context.
Well, I do think that it has a number of the elements that many of us would want to see. For example, the fact that the water rights system can expand and contract in response to water supply availability and so forth. But I think the thing that strikes me as the biggest issue is how much government funding has gone into this whole process. So if it's $25 billion that has gone in the context of the last 15 years or whatever it is, that's a lot of money. And there are many other solutions probably that you could come up with $15 billion or $25 billion. I mean, it's 6 times the cost of the Central Arizona. Not that I am aware of. In the management system, I mean, the Central Arizona project cost $4 billion. So that's just for comparison. But I do think it's really also important to note you can't just take something that is, even if you invested that much money, I don't think you could change the Colorado Rivers management system into the Murray-Darling management system, because you do have to protect the existing right holders at some level and sort of basically they bought off the people who would be hurt in this context. And so that's a lesson. When you make that kind of change, existing right holders really do need to have some form of protection, whether it's funding or water rights, et cetera.
Yeah, I would not say it's the gold standard, but I don't want to say that and discount the really valued work that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has done in terms of its engagement with Indigenous peoples in the basin. But all of that is to say that we heard yesterday, and we've heard through a lot of the presentations. Basically, how it goes is the authorities decide something, and then you're really excited about environmental flows and habitat restoration and species, and then Indigenous peoples are at the bottom. You kind of don't care, and that's a problem. We heard from our Aboriginal brothers yesterday that they can only use the water for domestic uses. So you want to relegate us to a space that confines us to 100 years ago without allowing us to evolve, and that's wrong. That's unjust. And so we need to fix that. So if we're talking about gold standards, there's a lot of work that still has to be done. And with that, when we talk about basin transferability, we've heard a lot about grants and entitlements. Aboriginal water rights, these are not grants or entitlements. These are reserved rights. These are rights that we never sold, we never gave away, we never told you could have them. And when you start to use language around grants and entitlements, you're grounding your language in the doctrine of discovery, and you're complacent with contemporary forms of colonization, and you have to recognize that.
I'll just make a couple of points. I mean, I think there's just a few, and some of them circle back to the things I made this morning. There are a couple of governance and geographical sort of drivers that have been contextually beneficial to addressing some of these issues in the Murray-Darling Basin. The first is we are all one country. Most of the other basins that have been studied actually go into other countries at different times. And also the flat landscape, which I sort of refer back to as a sort of an empirical sort of indicator of our ability to actually control the system in the traditional sort of engineering phase of development is far more limited, which has meant we've been living with scarcity a lot sooner than other places. We've also, more generally compared to our friends in the United States, have general acceptance for the role of government in the way these things are administered is slightly higher in Australia. It's a notch up, which means that there's actually a role. The role we see, generally speaking, for government in our affairs is a step up. I think that all solutions are contextual, and the metaphor I told, or the story I told about the fishway that was put in the 1940s for Pacific Northwest salmon in a flat river, and didn't really work too well, is a good example of how you just can't just take things and drop them into another context. You've got to really be mindful of that context. And I like the notion of a toolbox. If there are things we have done because we were sort of forced into to confront some of these issues in the 1980s and 90s and onwards that are useful, by all means, make use of them. And if they're not, or don't, or cut and paste those ones that actually work and modify them. They're not exclusive solutions. They're just things that we saw as necessary to be done at different times. But also, I think we've made much progress in a whole lot of areas, but there are things still to be done. I mean, the debate around cultural flows is something we're investing in, and the future may hold outcomes in that regard that I think we should be working towards. The Basin Plan doesn't achieve everything. It achieves the things it achieves, and there is still a wider discussion of things that can be done both through the federal system and also for the states themselves. I mean, the states still retain primary sovereignty over the water resources in the basin, and still not bound in innovating under that framework anyway. So I think it's important to just take that context on board.
You know, I'm primarily a political scientist by trade, and I work on design of institutional arrangements. And so in this subject matter, you know, this question of who's doing the right thing and what does it look like, my mind always goes to things like, you know, is there a planning process? What is the geographic scale of that process? How are markets utilized? All these sort of building blocks, you know, and that's immediately where my mind goes when we're talking about who's doing it right and what the model looks like. And yesterday at this time, you'll remember that session we had yesterday at this time, powerful session. We were hearing I won't say it was a contradictory viewpoint, but we were hearing a viewpoint about a management, you know, the ideal management system is one that's based around an ethical framework. It's based around respecting everyone that has a stake in the issue, and it's about processes that were open and full participation, and you know, it was again, it's not a contradictory idea from some of the more nuts and bolts we're talking about, but it was just very interesting to me. And I don't know if this is a question or not. You can respond to it if you want. It was just very interesting to me to define what is the ideal or what is the gold standard in terms of more of the way in which people treat each other in a process. And when I asked you this first question, most of the comments you made about the lessons really were about ways that people should be better at talking to each other and treat each other with more respect and more opportunities to explain to each other what they're concerned about. And so I guess it's an observation more than a question, but you're welcome to respond to it. But I think sometimes, at least for me, I overthink these issues. Or we, you know, take a step back, think of these things from more of a ethical standpoint, and it's an easier question. Okay, I don't know if that's you want to respond to that? You can if you want. Kathy, you want to? Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think it's unique to river basins or to solving any particular kind of problem. The whole idea of trusted relationships being the foundation on which, you know, government and institutions are built is fundamental. And the question is, how do you achieve that? And how do you, especially in a pluralistic society, in a very complicated topic, how do you empower people sufficiently that they can all play on an even playing field so that everybody has the capacity to engage in the conversation in a meaningful way? And I think we have entirely failed that in the United States. It doesn't matter whether you're indigenous or whether you can be any color or walk of life. If you are not somebody who has played the game of water management for perhaps decades, you're probably going to be excluded from the real insider conversation. because you don't know the language, people aren't comfortable with having you there at the table, and et cetera. So this is a universal problem well beyond water management, but it's not a big surprise that trusted relationships are the foundation of good governance.
It gets back to the idea that water issues are bigger than water issues. Okay. I said I was going to ask the panel 4 questions. Fourth of the 4 questions was just talk about whatever you want to talk about that I didn't ask you about. So keep that in mind. So I'll ask the 3rd question, the one that is actually a question, and then we'll transition to having someone else ask questions, because I think I've run out of steam on this. So the 3rd question, this is the question I actually really like, but I don't know if I have the right panel because John, well,
Pretty nervous.
We've already failed.
okay. I picked the panel, so there's a wonderful article recently I guess it was in the Albuquerque, what is it, Journal? Is that, what is it?
Yeah, the New Mexico in depth.
Okay, New Mexico in depth, talking about John's career as a journalist, where apparently he was known in the inner circles as the harbinger of doom, which doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound good. Kathy, I thought, said one of the most depressing things of the day today when earlier she said, facts don't matter anymore. So given that is backdrop, I want to challenge this panel to tell me why we should be, what reasons are there for optimism when it comes to the subject of water scarcity, given that populations are growing, given that climate change impacts are growing, given that the United Nations and every other international organization has highlighted water conflict and water scarcity as a problem that's likely to get much worse in this century. Given all these reasons to worry and to be pessimistic, cheer me up. Why should I feel better? We'll talk with the harbinger.
So the part that he didn't talk about was the fact that I sort of quit daily journalism because I was sick of being the harbinger of doom. And for a particular reason, which has to do with what makes me optimistic about water and water problems. And I think, I'm a storyteller, and I'm interested in the narratives and the stories we tell about our current lives and our futures. And there's this narrative about water, which I think Doug just really nicely articulated, about sort of doom and scarcity and increasing demands. And I've been struggling for a long time to understand the Australia-United States comparison, long conversations with Tony about this. And Tony finally clarified it for me in a conversation this morning. And then when he was talking, in the understanding here in the United States in the Colorado River Basin of the nature of the word shortage, where there is this expectation that we have this much water and we will always get it, and anything less than that is shortage and it is a bad thing. And Tony talks about the farmers in Australia who are simply used to the amount available going up and down and have developed this very sophisticated adaptive capacity to respond. But what you see here in the United States, in the Colorado River Basin and in New Mexico and the Rio Grande where I work, is in fact an enormous adaptive capacity already coming into play where, municipal water use is declining even as population rises in every major metro area in the Colorado River Basin, where, a lot of these large-scale agricultural communities, their agricultural productivity is rising even as they are doing this with less irrigated water. And so I think we've been telling ourselves the wrong story, and that as we grapple with sort of new sets of values and new needs to meet with this water, we need to recognize that, in fact, when we have less water, we use less water, and we've been pretty darn successful, and we need to remind ourselves of that story as we go into these scarcity crises.
Oh, well, I'd just reinforce that point. I think we talk about lessons from Australia. If there's any lesson, I think the central one is that in a world of sub-perfect water supply, there is an ability to innovate and adapt and have a thriving agricultural industry based on that is probably the greatest lesson, and people can adapt to that. It's about providing things like information and working with them to understand the nature of the risks they face in terms of their water access, that you can have that you can establish sharing arrangements and actually have thriving agricultural economies based on those things is really the great thing for optimism, I think. And I think the future belongs to those people, to the water users who actually get most adept at dealing with that scarcity and the rationing or whatever the language that gets used about that. That to me is really the sense of optimism. It's how we get there, and doing that in a way that gets there as not as quickly as possible, so much as effectively as possible, and involves as many people as possible. That's really that's what gives me optimism.
So for me, I think the most cheerful thing I heard this week actually has to do with the role of informal networks and the fact that networks themselves can be incredibly powerful in resolving issues, especially if they are sort of properly aligned with the issues that are being faced. And the fact that some of these really rigid prior appropriation systems are now sort of giving way to some of these more informal arrangements, whether it's in Arizona or the Rio Grande. I think we are talking about some shifts towards more flexibility that comes from that network concept.
Yeah, I was just waiting for everyone to say their thoughts. So I think from the presentations we heard this week, there was a lot of discussion around traditional knowledge. And I think one of the takeaways for me that was very inspiring is that traditional knowledge is a science. There isn't a competition. That's some invented idea that there's a competition between Western science and traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge is an applied science over thousands of years. So it should be in complementarity to Western science and not in this adversarial nature that it currently exists in. And so ways in which we can, as academics and practitioners, seek out the use of traditional knowledge in our research is really integral to moving forward with enhanced basin management. Additionally, we heard a little bit from the EPA about tribal water quality codes and treatment in the same manner as a state under the Clean Water Act. Currently, there are 52 tribes that have TAS status under the Clean Water Act, with a plethora more that have their own tribal water codes for managing their water outside of the EPA framework. So I think recognizing those tribal sovereign rights to manage their water is really important and is inspiring in terms of moving forward. And lastly, we heard from one Indigenous speaker this week who said that as Indigenous peoples, we operate from a spiritual context, which means that we don't operate from a position of fear when it comes to water management. And so the reality is we can't operate from a position of fear because our survival depends on it. And what that means for you is that we make some, as Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, we make some of your strongest allies in increasing the betterment of basin management.
Maybe just on simply the tools and the methods and approaches that are out there, I think what is a positive message for me listening to the discussion the last few days is that we really have a lot to offer in terms of the experience, the approaches, whether it's backcasting or forecasting scenario models, or it's mapping the relationships between where tribal nations are located in relation to infrastructure projects and valuable natural resources, or whether it's places where spiritual values have been integrated into environmental flow assessments. We have a lot of the tools and the approaches already at our disposal, and I think it's just a question of being more effective about how we use them and understanding when the enabling conditions are right to bring them into the room to solve particular problems, and to really start to work, I think, using these networks more effectively and proactively problem solving, really bringing people together to sit together in a room and seed in some of that experience around some of these tools and really start to iron out some of the problems, particularly in basins where there isn't this capacity, an existing capacity to do so, but where there's a great receptivity and openness to all of these parts of the toolbox that we already have as a global community working in this space.
I've been very slow in turning this over to you guys, and so let me rectify that right now. Again, questions to any particular individual or to the whole panel, or if there's just something you think that needs to be said that hasn't been said, say it. And I guess that's the only rules. Yes.
Thanks, Doug. Great panel. I just want to clarify within the Murray-Darling Basin that there is a third stakeholder besides Mildred and Anban. The work that they do is absolutely fabulous, don't get me wrong. They are absolutely on the ball. But the organisation I work for, the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, has 64 local Aboriginal land councils within the basin. They own freehold title. We are the largest collective Indigenous water holder in the country. Altman and Arthur 2009 affirms that. We've also trading. We've got local Aboriginal land councils leasing their water assets on the temporary water market. Okay, so the difficult thing with it is there are two bits of legislation, and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, being a federal agency, has to adhere to the National Native Title Act, which is in 1993. The agency that I work for was born out of the New South Wales 1983 Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and the incoming Dean, James Anaya, can attest to that. He is a partner, and he has been a keynote speaker at our annual gatherings. We have put submissions into the basin plan, but I do not want to walk away from the fact that both the Mildred and Anban are the leaders within the basin, and the work that they are doing is groundbreaking. And I think the other thing I want to say is with the TEK, it is a science, and it should be accepted, adopted, and integrated into any policy development.
Thank you. All right, okay, let me see who. I'm thinking to myself, who's traveled the furthest? Who's been the quietest to this point? Yeah. All right.
I suppose from our perspective, I suppose this is a question to the people that are in a position to implement. I don't know whether there's certain people on the panel that are in a position to implement what they've learnt from this gathering. One of the things that came out of this for me is what Kelsey said, and the main point that came across through the First Nations process within this conference was that treat us as a nation. Treat us as nations. Before Columbus landed, before Cook landed, we were nations. And I was only saying this morning that if I ask any one of you in the room, can you name 5 Aboriginal nations on the continent of Australia? How many can answer that? I don't see one hand. But if you sit in a conference, I'm talking to the Americans and the Canadians and all the other people from around the world. But if you ask somebody in Australia, name 5 American tribes, Native American tribes, they'll rattle them off like that, because they've accepted that those people were on this continent before Columbus and before the invasion of the West. So I think what's coming out of this for me, and it's very powerful, is that we're not dissimilar around the world. And we have a message in water. We have a message to say, don't take too much. Only take as much as you want or you need. And think of everything else around you. Unfortunately, in Australia, one tier of government, I won't say all tiers of government, and greedy irrigators took all the water. And that tier of government allowed them to do it. I showed in my presentation a farm, a cotton farm, that holds the same amount of water as Sydney Harbour. 5 times the amount of water that's in Sydney Harbour. And that's on a little river system. One little river system that's a part of this great Murray-Darling Basin. The federal government and the state government had the opportunity to buy it for $10 million. $10 million. The Prime Minister of Australia would not put in $5 million to buy it. So that's the form of thinking in Australia. And I must commend the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in what they're trying to do. But we are at least 3 years behind all the other science. And the Murray-Darling Basin plan is based around science, and we have to provide our science to the white man in our country that's been there for 200 years, and we've got to provide 40,000 years of science so that they can let us into the game. Thank you.
I'll come back to you, Mike. Mike wants to pick on me for my gold standard comment. I've suffered enough on that one, I think. I'm going to drift. No, Randy, you've missed. Well, then you're disqualified twice. If you knew him, you'd understand why I'm so mean to him. All right, anyone on this side of the room? Really? Oh. All right. Was that a, I have a question, or were you just stretching? Okay.
No. I would like to first say that I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm speaking for myself personally, but I'm going to pat my agency that I work for on the back. I think their investment in being a sponsor of this conference was certainly a very good decision to do so. With respect to this panel and the theme, just 2 points, and I'll keep them very short. It's entirely essential that collaborative partnerships and networks have a common unified vision. Getting people to agree, as Tony put it earlier, how you frame the problem certainly has a lot to do with the answers that you get to. I think we're saying exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. And the second point is with respect to those partnerships where you do have widely divergent views, needs, wants, and desires, is that will require, by definition, that some compromises be made. And the best way to ensure that compromises are made is to avoid power struggles. That is to say that you have a system of checks and balances so that no partner holds all the cards, and so that in turn is a feedback loop that requires you to continue working with one another. No one can just, pick up their ball and leave the table, so to speak. And the way to do that, of course, is to make sure that you don't have inequality of power. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are welcome to respond to anything if you want, but I think we're
more back there.
We're in more of the speech mode at the moment than the question mode. All right, this way, Kathy.
Yes, John.
Okay. John, I'm going to challenge you to ask a question in under 30 seconds.
Are we seeing the beginning of what in U.S. law would be called procedural due process, which refers to the essential notion that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu?
Good question. You nailed that. All right. Who do you want to answer that question?
So are you asking whether this is the beginning of due process? Because clearly, no, I get that. I mean, I think the recognition of the importance of process is something that's not new. And I don't think the recognition that, people need to be treated with respect, and including Indigenous people need to be part of the process. That's not a new concept, but we have globally continued to make the same mistakes, even though we have understood that for some time. But I do think people understand that process is important and relationships are important. But I don't know that that's always or even the dominant regime.
I think one of the things that I argue in my book, and I'm specifically now talking about process in the Colorado River Basin, is that to the extent that there are people who have not been included in the process, that the processes have failed, and one of the pathways to success of the current processes is expanding the function of the network to ensure that, and specifically I'm talking about the Colorado River Basin, I'm talking about indigenous communities, I'm talking about the relationship between the United States and Mexico was often excluded from these processes, and I'm talking about the environment itself and the set of human environmental values around that. In all three of those areas, we are making progress toward inclusion, and to the extent that we fail, the processes will fail. And to the extent that we're going to succeed with these processes, we have to be sure that all of those different folks are included.
So I think on the First Nations side for Canada, we've seen new commitments from the Prime Minister related to UNDRIP and generally enhancing, I don't necessarily want to call it consultation, but enhancing the relationship between the federal government and First Nations within Canada. I don't necessarily know if you can call that procedural due process, but it's something new. Here within the U.S., I would say federal Indian law, we often talk about the pendulum and the way that it swings. I'd say probably in the past 10 years, it's been swinging very much in the favor of tribes towards procedural due process and having a greater capacity and stake within decision-making bodies related to natural resource management generally. But with changing administrations, we don't know which way that pendulum is ever going to swing, and so it makes it very difficult for us to assert our rights and to generally continue with best management practices.
All right, you traveled a long way.
Okay, no, I was trying to come on earlier, so this wasn't too harsh, too late. But you talked about a gold standard and whether Murray-Darling is a gold standard. And does a gold standard mean the standard for those who have the gold, or a standard of good performance? Because you need to recall that Australia is a continent of 25 million people who've spent 25 billion to try and get the Murray-Darling working. Now, if you try to take those approaches worldwide, you would need $9 trillion simply for the water management and irrigation districts. Now, Australia can afford it. There was a lovely cartoon of Hu Jintao saying to Kev Rudd, look, that's fine. You keep the outside and we'll take the inside. Australia is rich by virtue of selling appropriated mineral resources. Much of the rest of the world can't do that. So I'd like to put the question whether you're in fact not the gold standard, but the gold-plated example of water resource management, which can only with very, very great difficulty and only in little elements be replicated elsewhere. Sorry.
Let's talk.
Is that for me to answer?
You have to have deep pockets to do this work.
Just two things. First, the 25 billion, I'm not sure where that came from. The number that for the federal reforms of the last decade is 14 billion Australian, so there still is a lot of money. I just clarify that. Look, I don't know. I mean, it's probably the perspective. Part of the reason various Australians are here is to get perspective on the way we've gone about solving our challenges. But it also goes to the extent to which a society is prepared to invest to actually address some of the issues that it faces. Australia is we normally say 24 million people, only 2 million of which live in the basin, another million who live just outside who rely on its water. But collectively, as a nation, we've decided to invest in this solution. So whether it's gold, we had the phrase gold-plated, I think. I mean, gold plating tends to mean something else again, in my view, that where things are overdone. This is about whether it's whether this is the cost it has been to address it. There are potentially other ways of doing it, but with other costs that come about. So I'm stuck there in terms of answering the question more specifically, I suppose. So.
Yeah, just to respond a little bit to that in terms of the knowledge that's come out of that basin. A lot of the cost, I think, well, some part of the cost, a large part of the cost, was around dealing with mistakes that have been made in the past. If they were proactively thought through, perhaps some of that cost, in terms of, I'm thinking particularly around cost to get environmental water back in wetland systems, the cost of restoring some of those environments. If that was more proactively thought through in some of the other places where we can see that looming on the horizon, I think perhaps that cost investment would be a lot less, because we would be proactively keeping water in systems, having a more protective view of the natural environments and the resources that we're depending upon. I think that would definitely narrow the gap between perhaps gold-plated and the gold standard in that respect. And I do think, if I think back on my own experience in starting some of the conversations around environmental water management between Australia and South Africa back in the 90s, a lot of the knowledge has great value, has been replicable to other places at fairly low cost. A lot of the tools that we've jointly developed along the way on how to calculate environmental water needs, whether it's in the reserve process or whether it's some other whole ecosystem process has been applied in Australia. Those methodological experiences and tools have been taken up and used in many countries, many river basins that are very, very data poor, information poor, and financially not in a position to invest in the way that Australia or the US has invested in its water resource management. So that investment has paid off, I think, in a way where we can capitalize a lot on the investment in terms of what the products that have been developed and the experience, and how that can be invested in places that won't have the financial capacity, and where the pressure is on them right now, whether it's large hydropower infrastructure development or dealing with water insecurity at a local scale. We can apply that right now in those places, regardless of their financial situation or the status of their institutions. There's plenty of work that can be done with what we have at our disposal.
I guess I would just say that the danger in sort of having it be perceived as the gold standard across the world, which in many ways I think it has been, is the idea that the private sector or the market approach to resolving water rights issues can stand on its own and solve problems. And I think that is a fairy tale, because you have to have a really robust institutional and management system standing behind this, as Dustin has been saying. It just doesn't happen that private sector capitalist perspectives are going to take care of the broad societal interests or the environmental issues, period. We know that because we've seen that experiment play out across the entire globe over millennia. So
I'm going to seek out at least one more question. While I do that, I'll look to my panel and say, is there any, remember I told you, if there's anything you want to say, make sure you find a place to say it. This would be that place if there's anything left.
Make a quick comment and decide which gold is it plated by. Full gold or pure gold. Because there's a difference. If it's full gold, then it's not as valuable as the real gold.
All right. Nope. One sentence? Not a run-on sentence. Properly punctuated sentence. All right, one sentence.
Costing in 2006, the conservative Stern Review found that we can expect a minimum, if we do not act decisively, of 5% of economy, of losses to the economy of every state and nation, indefinite future, and it may go up to 20% with higher estimated impacts, such as those which we have gotten in the recent IPCC. That makes fixing things cheap.
No. All right. I thought I was going to have to let Randy ask his question.
Thanks, Doug. This question, I think, is primarily for John, but Kelsey's thoughts and the thoughts of others would be welcome too. John's been spending a lot of time with this idea of an informal network and how it's essential to governance in the Colorado River Basin. As an optimist, and I think optimism is a positive thing. I guess my question is, you mentioned that the circle needs to be grown out to include or be more inclusive of indigenous peoples. What should the place of indigenous peoples look like within Colorado River governance? What should it look like within the informal network? Further, is an informal network itself sufficient, given the nation-to-nation emphasis that Kelsey's brought up, for giving indigenous people within the Colorado River Basin an adequate voice?
So what the role of indigenous communities should look like, and I think this actually generalizes to, I think, what the role of every community needs to look like, is what that community itself wants its role to be. And I think, of all the participants and players in the network, in the Colorado River Basin, the Native American communities are the ones who have not yet achieved that. And I've started to say been given that, but it's a more complicated thing than that. And this is the risk of the argument I'm making. This is how it could fail, is the informal network. For a long time I used the metaphor of the hotel bar, and people meeting in a hotel bar after, people getting together in a hotel bar after a meeting, and this really ticked my daughter off, because she says, the sort of moral compass behind me, my child is saying, yeah, but Dad, who gets left? Who's not going to the bar? Who doesn't drink? Who doesn't like to be in that setting? And that's a sort of fundamental shortcoming that I kind of recognize, and I'm not sure I see how to get around it, other than a sort of concerted effort by the participants in the network as it now exists to be inclusive of those people who deserve a place in the network, but really importantly, who, if they're not included, the thing falls apart. We fail because important interests are excluded, and we end up with solutions that sow discord, which make the thing not work in the long run.
Thank you for your question, Jason. And I think this is a good time for me to kind of add some of my other final remarks too, Doug, so it might be a little bit longer. Apologies to the panel. But I think maybe we also need to distance ourselves. I know it's conditional on the informal networks using the term community, but I just return us back to the fact that these are nations. These are governments. They are the third sovereign within the United States Constitution. So we really have to be hearkening to that. And I think also within Canada, First Nations are sovereign. So anytime that the Canadian government, the US government, the provinces, the states are at the table, the tribes and First Nations should be at the table too. It's just as easy as that. That's how easy it is for us. And if there are meetings where it's just states and the federal government, then that's when we get upset. I think we're also looking for there to be some outrage from the rest of the world pertaining to how we're treated. I mean, there are Flint, Michigan, everywhere across Indian country. But they're constantly ignored. We're constantly treated as second-class citizens in the United States and Canada, and as we heard from our Australian brothers and sisters, there too. Just within here in the Colorado River Basin, we learned this week that there are 80,000 Navajos who have to haul water on a daily basis. That's in the United States of America. That's unacceptable. It's 2016. That is unacceptable. And, don't even get me started on the Animas River spill and everything that happened with that and the Navajo Nation and all the other nations within this basin. And so, we have to start to ask ourselves, are we really being just and equitable in our decision making around water in the United States, Canada, and Australia? Additionally, we talked a lot about shortages this week. And I loved Dan McCool's reference to the car. But, it really is. It's unjust for you to ask us to share the burden in a problem that we didn't create and we didn't reap the benefits of for the past half century. And additionally, you're asking us to share the burden so that you can have a manicured golf course in a desert while we can't practice our cultural and ceremonial ways. It's like, we want our golf course, so we want to sacrifice your church. That's not just, and that's not, when we talk about water ethics, that's not ethical. And lastly, we talked a lot this week about the hydropower boom. And there really wasn't a lot of negative around that. It was like, oh, these are these great innovations. And it really kind of made me sad because I felt like we went back 50 years to the Army Corps of Engineers where they wanted to play God. And maybe we still kind of want to play God and think that we can control Mother Nature. But in doing that, in these hydropower innovations that you're carrying out, you have to recognize the inherent violent legacy of those innovations, of those hydropower facilities, of those dams, the real lives that they've impacted. I mean, you may think that the last forced relocation of Indian people within the United States happened on the Trail of Tears. But really, one of the most recent forced relocations of Indian people in the United States happened in the 1960s with the building of the Kinzua Dam. You forcibly removed the Seneca Nation of Indians from the Allegheny Reservation in Pennsylvania, burned their homes down, and then flooded their burial grounds and their ancestral sites so you could build the Kinzua Dam and the Kinzua Reservoir. And that's now happening all over the world, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, and other places. We heard about the neotropics, and you talk about, we've built all of our dams in the United States, so now let's export our experience to the rest of the world. Well, as Indigenous peoples, when you say that, we hear you exporting colonization. We hear you exporting that violent legacy that you had here to these other poor, disenfranchised populations within the world. And so with that, what I want to leave you with is, something a bit more inspiring, hopefully, is to encourage you to start to think about ways your research, your studies, your language can be decolonized. How do you decolonize your discourse? Find ways for your research to recognize the diversity that's inherent in the world's river basins. If you're not recognizing that diversity, you're doing a disservice to the management of that basin. And we heard from the elder yesterday that was so beautiful that she wanted us to respect the water. But we can't even begin to respect the water until we start to respect each other. And so that's what I would encourage you to do, to take away from this conference and to go back to your agencies, your universities, your organizations that you're practicing within, and take that message. So, thank you.
Well, I haven't done a great job with this panel, but I do know a ending point when I hear it. So let's please thank the panel. Join me in thanking the panel. Let me just wrap this up by not all the thank yous again. There's been a lot of thank yous this week, but again, we can't do this without the sponsors. We can't do this without the people donating their time. And the thing that's always distinguished this conference from other conferences is that we always get really good audiences here, really sharp, thoughtful people, and it's happened yet again I don't know how it happens, but it keeps happening. So thank you all for coming.